Hello and welcome to another episode of Alberta's Regiment, Stories of the South Alberta Light Horse. My name is Wes Krause, curator of the Regimental Museum for the South Alberta Light Horse. And with me today is Captain Don Girling, Canadian Army Cadet Instructor. Welcome, Don.
Good morning. Thank you for that. I've been with the regiment, South Alberta Light Horse Cadets, for over 18 years, was twice the CO, and I'm also a member of the Regimental Association. And it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce today Major Shawn Thirlwell, who I've known for 18 years or better. We've been on a couple of training missions with some of my senior cadets, and various other tours, also to Europe on the battlefield tour. So it's my really pleasure to have a chance to chat with you today and have you relate some of your experiences with your long career with the South Alberta Light Horse and you being with B Squadron. So my first question would be, I'd like to know from you what motivated you to join the military, and where did you do your first training?
Well, thank you, Wes and Don. It's great to be here. Actually, I'm haven't been interviewed before, and it's good to actually be able to relay some of this. And it's an interesting question there, Don, because my career started back in '78, and at that time I joined as a young troop. And my motivation there, I can't really say was anything special. It was probably just a young lad, not much to do. My father was in the Army for a few years. My grandfather died in World War II, so there was a bit of family background. So that's probably what got me into it. But I'd say what really brought me back was the camaraderie of the regimental family. And in fact, I was in for about 3 years, got out, went to university, did a few things, and I got back in the Army about 15 years after that. And that's where the real motivation to rejoin the regiment was. And it was basically 15 years that there wasn't a day that went by that I didn't miss being in the regiment. You know, we talk about regimental family, and that was what it was all about. The friends, the comrades, the lifestyle that we did was something that was, that I developed during those first 3 years, and that's what really brought me back, was to be back in that family. So.
Well, being a member since 1978, you've obviously gone through a lot of training. Can you just give us kind of an idea of some of the things that you've done?
Well, in those days, the military, especially the reserves, was not quite as developed or as refined as it is now. And in fact, in those early days, we did a lot of things that probably wouldn't be allowed to go through now. We were a reconnaissance regiment at that time, and Edmonton had just stood up as a squadron. Medicine Hat being the home of the regiment, they opened up a squadron in Edmonton to bring armored to that city. And so when we joined there, we didn't have a lot of infrastructure. In fact, there's only 7 of us original soldiers. We were privates, and there was one lieutenant, and that was all there was. So our equipment, we pretty much had to steal on a regular basis. In other words, our Jeeps were locked in a compound that we didn't have access to, so in order to get it, we had to break in occasionally to get those and use them. So there was a lot of that, and a whole lot of training of ourselves. And without that kind of infrastructure, we didn't have a lot of direction. There wasn't a lot of equipment in those days. I remember heading down to Medicine Hat to join A Squadron on exercise, and we'd go down in Jeeps with no tops in the middle of January, and no winter equipment or anything, and it was quite an adventure getting here. But what I noticed changed when I came back those years later, and I rejoined the regiment back in '95, and the biggest thing I noticed was a professional reserve army at that time. There was infrastructure, there were NCOs, there was a method of training, there was, I'm not to say that there wasn't courses and proper discipline and all that stuff, but I think there was a lot more focus on the reserves, and the government and the Army as a whole started looking at it as they were part-time soldiers as opposed to, they're reservists, they're not real soldiers, right? So I noticed that. So there was direction, there was infrastructure, there was NCOs that were doing training, there were regular courses, the equipment we had at that time rolled into Cougars. So now it was a tank regiment at that time. So when I came back in as an officer and in the Cougar troops who were training as tankers now. So that had changed. As we went through, the Army changed with the change in society. There was no longer a Cold War with the Russians, so the sense of the need to have the tanks was not quite there anymore. So they re-rolled our regiment, as they did with most of the reserve armored regiments, into reconnaissance. We went back to what we were, and so now we're into G-wagons and doing that role. And that's kind of where we're at right now. Is we're still a recce regiment, and but it was interesting for me because I started in recce and back in recce, so back to my old roots, I guess you could say.
So how do you find today the changes in the equipment that you're using in terms of, you talked a little bit about it, but the G-Wagon, for instance, you're now using that.
It's interesting because when we started with Jeeps, okay, these were the old 56 pattern Jeeps, basically Korea War Jeeps, Willys, if you were, and now we're of course into German Mercedes. The equipment's very similar, right? It's an all-wheel drive, 4 wheels. It's got a machine gun on top. But the difference really for my experience was we did it with just 2 crew members, the crew commander and the driver. Now you've got 3 or 4 in the G-Wagon. So they've kind of changed a bit of the doctrine. But the actual equipment isn't a lot different. It's still a vehicle, a wheeled vehicle. It's still got a machine gun on there. So there's not a lot of difference there. I mean, for the period before when we were in the Cour, well, that certainly was a significant change for me at that time because, an actual armored vehicle we had gotten out of there since the late 60s, and that was a significant. But right now, it's almost like where we were back 30 years ago, so it's kind of interesting.
So you've obviously seen a number of commanding officers come and go, and been involved in some of the change of command parades and such. And you've had some particular involvement in some of those, I understand.
Well, absolutely. You and I, actually, that's where I first met you, Don, was change of command from Colonel Hodgson to Colonel Douglas. His change of command, we wanted to do something special because, of course, Colonel Hodgson was a horseman and he spent a lot of his career. In fact, his family owns a ranch, and so he was the epitome of cavalry officer. So we always aspired, most of us young officers wanted to be cavalrymen too. So I got into horses at that time and I was quite into it. So we thought we'd do a special parade and we'd do a bit of an escort guard for this colonel as he's going out. So myself and a couple of sergeants came to your ranch. You loaned us your horses and we decided, let's do this parade. But that was kind of interesting because, as I recall, your horses were not quite used to kind of a parade setting. So we spent a bit of time breaking him to that sense, and then when the day came, which was actually the next day, and we went on parade, it was quite fun because I remember myself and Sergeant McHugh, and we were riding out onto Parade Square in the dress rehearsal, and then the artillery band started up with their bass drum. Soon, first note, boom, it was like a cannon shot, and the horses went everywhere. And so we had a bit of a rodeo there on the Parade Square, and we settled down. It went on for a bit, and then the parade went. It went on not too bad, but I remember at one point we were supposed to, come up to the colonel who was leaving, give him a horse and ride off in sunset. Well, that didn't work so good because the horses were skittish, and I remember mine was backing up into the new Colonel Douglas, and he told me afterwards it was about a half a foot away from him putting his sword down and poking the horse in the butt because he was backing into him. But needless to say, it settled down. We got the old Colonel on the horse and we went off for a ride. But that again was another adventure because as soon as you put Colonel Hodgson on a horse, he wanted to go places. So we actually toured most of the city on horseback for the rest of the day. But that was an interesting go. Yeah, certainly.
And you've had, being in B Squadron and living in Edmonton, of course, in your career, and we hadn't touched on that yet, but you were with Canada Post you still are with Canada Post, I understand.
Yes, sir.
And you did some duties with the Lieutenant Governors as an aide de camp.
Yes, that was actually another interesting story too, because the aide de camps are usually more senior officers that do that role, because as you can well imagine, you're with the Lieutenant Governor and you're supposed to help him with protocol, and when he goes out on his visits and his dinners and his tours, whatever, you're sort of the guy that kind of navigates him through all the politics and the handshake and make sure everything's all proper etiquette and all that. Well, when myself and Colonel Steele were made aide-de-camps, we were actually both just second lieutenants. And at the time, it was Bud Olson, that became the lieutenant governor, and they had no aide-de-camps at that time because all but one had left because they had spent so much time with the previous lieutenant governor. They needed a break, so they needed somebody right away. And of course, our Colonel Hodgson at the time was the Master of Arms. So he said, "I've got officers, I'll put them in place." So baptism by fire for sure. So you got two junior officers that barely know how to be officers are now the ones who are responsible for protocol at probably the most highest levels within Alberta. And we didn't do so good. We had a lot of problems in our own knowledge, but we learned quickly and we got through it. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There was a lot as officers in this regiment. We often spend a lot of time in those circles. So I've met the lieutenant governors on all of the levies that we do, the New Year levies. So all the officers are introduced, and there was at one time I went to the levy where Lieutenant Governor Hull was lieutenant governor at that time, and I went in a uniform that was questionable at the time. I had worn a Sam Brown belt, which is a brown leather belt that they wore in the early days around World War II, World War I, and all that. And I had put that on because I was wearing patrol uniform at the time, which you can wear Sam Brown with patrol uniform, but whether it's the dress of the day or not is in question. Of course, being a young officer at that time, maybe that was not quite the right uniform. Anyhow, raised a little bit of questions. I remember the RSM having a chat with me about that, but yeah, we get away with a few things once in a while.
So you mentioned you met several of the lieutenant governors. Do any of them stand out in your mind?
It's they all have their differences, right? For my sake, Bud Olson was probably the one that stands out the most because I was his aide-de-camp, and he actually used to be an honorary colonel of this regiment way back, even before that. So he had had a little bit of connection with the regiment. So that was kind of nice because when we came out, especially when we came down to Medicine Hat for things, he knew the Medicine Hat, he knew our regiment, he knew about us. So that was a bit. It was quite nice to be able to have that connection, a very personal one with the lieutenant governor. So.
Now, also, in some of your training, I understand you went through a number of, I believe they call them gun camps?
Oh, yes. Pretty much every year the regiment goes through a gun camp. It's our time of year to hone our skills for shooting our weapons and all that. Most gun camps are two parts. One would be with our small arms to do your basics, so then the other ones would be with the vehicles, i.e. when we had the Cougars, that would be when we'd fire the Cougars and do our big weapon stuff. So every year we do that, and I've gone through obviously quite a few of them, and they're very interesting, and they've changed, as Don had mentioned. What I've seen over the years, that's one of the big significant things you've seen. You go from the like I was raised on the FN rifle and the submachine gun of the era. They changed to now the new, they call it the C7 now, and then of course we used to have the machine gun we used at that time, we called it the GPMG for a general purpose machine gun, but it was basically World War II era machine gun. That's what we were using back in the 70s, and now we're into a more modern one. They call it the C6. There's really no definition about that, but it's a modern weapon, and that's what we're into now. So in our gun camps, as we progress, we get into the new weapon systems and we learn how to use those. So, but they're really interesting for other people to join in, because we all often offer for the soldiers' bosses on their civilian employment to come out to these gun camps and to partake in them and see what the soldiers do. So that's a good opportunity for the civilian employers to see what the reserve soldier does. And of course, Don and his cadets always welcome, and it's a good opportunity for the young people to come and see what what the armies can offer. So.
Well, you mentioned with your employer was Canada Post. Were they supportive of your service in the
Absolutely. Canada Post being, of course, a government agency, they're very supportive of the military. My entire career, I've never had a time when they wouldn't let me go for my training, and it was significant. I mean, granted, I took a lot of my own personal vacation, but certainly the Canada Post Corporation was more than willing to allow me the time to finish that. And I think that certainly helped in my career.
How do you think your experiences as an officer in the Army, that training that you've gleaned from that, how do you feel that's helped you in your civilian career?
Oh, immensely, immensely. And I mean, a good example is even yesterday I was talking to my civilian boss, who was the director of the plant in Edmonton, the processing plant in Edmonton, and I was discussing, we were having a chat about some of the troubles we're having with some of the supervision within the plant and some of the direction that we're going with our management style in that. And I quite often refer to the military. So here's what we do, and like for instance, I might even talk about some of the ethics that the military trains us in, and how that relates. So a lot of the leadership, a lot of the man management, as it were, a lot of the resource management, and even things as defined as our ethics, and how we relate that, because that's one of the key things in the military is everybody has their own personal ethics, but the Army has a set of guidelines that, as being Canadians, this is our expectation, right? So whether your personal ones are not quite in line, you always have to follow the ethics of the government, of what Canada and what Canadians want. So same thing in Canada Post. Canada Post has a set of values that, whether they're my personal ones or not, I still need to focus on that. So that ability to direct myself and to help direct individuals towards that has helped a lot.
Is there anything in your career that stands out as a story that would be worthy of comment on?
There's so many, right? There's so many, and when you're placed in a situation, say, well, tell me some. It's like, oh, no, I can't remember any of them, right? It's when you get in the mess that you bring out all of the ones when you're young troops and all that. But the ones that stick in the mind the most are the ones back when I joined as a young troop, right, and I was as a private trooper and that kind of thing. And those days are very interesting. And the one that kind of reminds me, or always remember, is how simple things were us. And as an example, and in this one was, the RSM needed a Jeep to go somewhere. So a typical command from an RSM soldier, go get me a Jeep. And so that request was given to our now Colonel Steele at the time, and he went to go get a Jeep. Well, the first one right in front happened to be the General's Jeep. So he took it. And well, you would imagine what happened to him afterwards, but the point being is how simple as a soldier you might think an order can be without actually following it through. It can be quite interesting. So that's probably one of the most funny ones. In my career, I've not had the ability through personal life and whatever to have gone overseas on a tour. But the one thing that I did do was it was an exercise called the Cambrian Patrol, which is an international competition held in England, where they do where the SAS do their training in the Black Mountains in Wales. So it's an international competition for all top reconnaissance units to do stuff, to do basic reconnaissance training. So we put a team together, and this was quite a coup for our adjutant at the time there, Captain Broomfield, because he got a team together, which was in itself an effort trying to get the Army to approve something like this. But we went over with this ragtag team of Sally Horse guys, some Loyal Edmonton Regiment guys, and I think there was even an artillery fellow in there. So we got a bunch of mixed blood of people going over on this high level competition. And though it was tremendously difficult, and at the time when I finished it, I said to myself I would never do anything like that again. It's probably one of the most fulfilling and rewarding things that I've ever did. And not so much that we finished the competition, but the progress through there. Taking the different soldiers from different units, different levels. We had like the most experienced guy was a Master Corporal from the Loyal Edmonton Regiment. That was the most experienced we had, and the least experienced was a trooper from our regiment who had just finished his basic, and we're off doing this this high level reconnaissance exercise. And we're talking about guys that like the Para regiments, the Gurkha regiments, the U.S. Rangers. Those are the people who are partaking in this, and here we are, right? Some backwater Albertan, yokels, and we're in this thing. And we didn't get the top level, but we actually made a bronze level on that. So that was an achievement in itself. So that whole progress of training for this and getting these group of lads together, and me being, I wasn't a young man, but I was certainly a young officer because I just made my lieutenants at that time, and making this happen and actually going through finishing it and coming out the other end reasonably unscathed was quite a boon for the regiment at that time, I think.
So as your career has been progressing, I would assume that you've mentored a lot of younger entry-level officers as well too. How much of a contribution have you made, with them at that?
Well, it's an interesting question in the sake that is it me or is it my position, right? So being now a senior officer as a major, but as an officer goes through his career and he becomes the battle captain, which is basically the guy that runs the training for the squadron, becoming a squadron commander, becoming a regimental 2IC, as I am now, my career is in all those positions. I'm expected to be doing that kind of mentoring for the soldiers, the young officers. But I think as a reserve unit, I think a lot of us officers, when we mentor young officers is more not just Army, but your own personal, right? Because we're all people of industry. We're all in the civilian world, and most of us have jobs that are in that same role. So myself in Canada Post, being a manager within that organization, obviously I've gained a lot of managerial experience and all that. So I think when we bring these new officers and we're mentoring, there's a lot of mentoring on the civilian concepts as much as the military concept. And I think that's where I've gained a lot there. So as Don asked me, how does my military help the civilian? Well, there's a lot of civilian that helps the military, because as we all know, being in the reserves, it's a part-time job. It's not the job. You can't discipline in the same manner. You can't have the same expectations. It's a lot different. So having that civilian background allows you to deal with civilian soldiers in the same concept, right? So.
Now, over the time that you've been in, you've seen a change in some of the equipment, like the vehicles and such like that. Are you involved with the preservation of any of the period vehicles?
Yeah, I try to get involved as much as possible. I mean, that's where I'd like to be fully employed, but of course my position doesn't give me that. But I myself have got a couple of older vehicles. I've got the Iltis, which is a Jeep that we had back in the 80s and early 90s. But I also have myself, it's called a Universal Carrier, which is a vehicle from World War II. So I've got that vehicle myself that I've had to rebuild it a few times because it's kind of hard to get parts those days. But one of the things that I was not involved directly, but certainly involved in the encouraging process, is when we restored our half-track. So this half-track was from World War II. It was a command CP for Colonel Witherspoon for the South Alberta Regiment in World War II. And the 3 soldiers that actually did the restoration of that put in well over 10,000 man-hours to put that thing back together. And though we were supportive as a regiment, and a lot of their time was paid for because that was instead of doing their training, they were doing that. I would say much more was not paid for, because we certainly didn't pay 10,000 man-hours because we don't have that in our budget. But that was a labor of love for those 3 individuals, and it was a wonderful addition to basically the fleet that we have here for the regiment. It was the other interesting aspect of it. It also brought together a lot of the veterans from the South Alberta Regiment. And in fact, one of the soldiers, Sergeant McHugh, who was kind of leading this restoration, he had met with one of the SAR guys who actually crew commanded that. So that was Sergeant Ken Armstrong, who I'm sorry to say had passed away just last month, but he was involved in that. And I remember when Rob McHugh told me that when he was interviewing him about what did it look like, what did this, he was kind of badgering Ken about it, and Ken said, it was 65 years ago, I don't remember that well. So it was quite humorous, but he did remember a significant amount that helped in that restoration. So.
That actual, just to talk on it a bit more, so that, because I think it's something that might be of interest to, certainly interest to me, is we were able to trace the history of that actual one that we restored correctly.
Yes.
And can you just touch on a little bit of what you found when you did the?
Well, again, Sergeant McHugh was the one who did all the research, and I'm not nearly as able to talk on it as he would. So if you ever get him in the seat here, definitely bring it up. But one of the key things that they chat about is how did they get that back to Canada, right? Because at the end of the war, regiments were basically entitled to bring back a military vehicle to keep back at their home base as a memento of the thing. So that's what they chose for South Alberta Regiment, was the half track. So they were having difficulty trying to get it back to Canada, and when they brought it back, they basically stored it in a sea can, and they called it. I can't remember what it was, but it wasn't a vehicle. It was something like K rations or something like that, and so they threw it on and shipped it over. But it got on the wrong vehicle, on the wrong ship. It didn't come to Canada port. It came to a U.S. port. So now it's in the U.S. port, and they open it up. They see what it is, and they say, if you want it, come get it. So they sent a trooper from Alberta down to New York to pick this thing up and get it back. And it wasn't so bad for him driving it back, but it was crossing the border, which was the big problem, because he couldn't get this military vehicle across the border. So what he did, he's got in touch with the old bootleggers and found the old bootlegger run across the border into Alberta. And that's how he got it through. So yeah, it's a bit of an interesting story that makes you wonder again about how things get done. But
So, what's your future for the regiment now?
well,
Service with.
I am getting long in the tooth here, so there's not a number of years I have left. But as the 2IC, it's my responsibility to take over the regiment after Colonel Steele steps down in a few years. So I am slated currently to be the next CO, but there's a lot of things that happen that influence that. So it may not be something that'll happen or not, but that's my role. If I'm not, then I'll carry on with my with my tenure in this basic role as second in command. If I'm not going to take on that role, I'll have to hand it off to who will. But I'll be in the in the senior leadership of the regiment and trying to, as you mentioned before, guide the young officers in their role and things like that. When I get done, well, that's when I can start really getting into that restoration thing, because we have an association. I'm part of the association as is, but when I'm retired from the regular Army, I'll get more involved in the association. I'll probably start getting into more of the vehicle restoration and try to keep that thing moving along.
I think if you assume command, I think Don could supply a horse. Am I correct?
Yeah, I still got a few broncs out there.
Properly trained.
Well, judging from our past experience now, I might not be quite as fit as I was in that day, and I might have to pass on that one.
Oh, gee, I got a new one that you'd love.
Oh, I bet you do.
Nice gray.
Yeah, it's interesting because our roots as armored soldiers is from the cavalry, and anytime we can try to maintain those roots, that's what we'd like to do. And I know Colonel Steele is looking at trying to get us some professional development in the summer to try to get us out back onto horses and trying to restore a little bit about that. We are Albertans, right? That's
Alberta's regiment is right.
Absolutely.
That's for sure.
And part of Alberta is horses, right?
Yeah, that's true.
For sure.
Well, Shawn, Major Thirlwell, thank you very much for joining us and relating your stories and your experiences. And you've had quite a career with the military and specifically with the South Alberta Light Horse.
Well, much appreciated. I'm glad for the opportunity to tell a little bit of what goes on here.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching another episode of Alberta's Regiment.